It was a crisp, bright morning on March 25, 1989. The streets of Riverdale County were bathed in sunlight, the perfect kind of day where everything felt simple, almost idyllic. Children played outside, the air buzzed with the hum of spring, and life felt impossibly safe. But in the Turner household, nestled in the quiet suburbs of northern states, the last moments of Emily Turner, 50, and Sarah Turner, 48, were unfolding in a way no one could have predicted. The two sisters, their faces flushed with the joy of spring break, stepped out of their front door, laughing as they made their way toward Maplewood Mall. The mall was just a few blocks away, a familiar spot for the Turner family, and a place where many afternoons had been spent shopping, eating pizza, and enjoying the little luxuries of youth. Today it was no different. Emily at 14 and Sarah at 12 were already making plans in their heads, browsing through stores, peeking at Easter displays in the windows, maybe even meeting some classmates. They had no idea that this would be the last time their parents, David and Rebecca Turner, would see them safe and sound, laughing together. They waved goodbye to their mother, a quick smile exchanged between them and Rebecca, who reminded them, as she always did, about the 4 p.m. curfew. No one knew that these last moments would be imprinted on Rebecca's memory for the rest of her life, their carefree smiles, the way Emily's hand briefly brushed against Sarah's as they walked out into the world, unaware of the dangers silently waiting for them. The air seemed to shift as they disappeared from view, their figures growing smaller against the backdrop of the sprawling suburban streets. Everything appeared normal. Yet, as Rebecca Turner lingered in the doorway for just a moment longer than usual, a deep, unshakable feeling settled in her chest. It was that strange, inexplicable sensation, the kind that often accompanies a mother's intuition, that whispered to her that something wasn't right. As David Turner drove home later that evening, the world around him remained unchanged. Traffic flowed steadily, birds chirped in the distance, and families gathered around their dinner tables. But the Turner family's world was about to shatter, in a way so incomprehensible, it would haunt them for the next 36 years. Thank you to all of our returning viewers for your unwavering support. Your engagement truly means the world to us. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Join our community and be part of these crucial stories that bring justice, awareness, and truth to light. And for those of you who choose not to subscribe, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't hold back, rant, vent, or share your perspective in the comments. We value every opinion because every voice matters in these conversations. Let's keep this discussion alive. Your input is what keeps us going. Subscribe, share, and keep the dialogue flowing below. David Turner's life, by all outward appearances, was the epitome of success. He had built a career that many would envy, a voice that resonated across the airwaves of Capital City, known to thousands as the charismatic host of a popular radio show on Mal FM. His voice was warm, smooth, and reassuring, a comforting presence that started each morning for the residents of the city. The kind of voice that made you feel like everything was going to be okay, no matter how hectic the day might get. To the people of Capital City, David Turner was a local celebrity, someone they trusted, someone who had become a part of their daily lives. But beyond the microphones, David was first and foremost a husband and a father. When the lights of the studio dimmed, and the sound of his voice was no longer carrying through the speakers, he returned to his family, his anchor in a world that sometimes felt overwhelming. His home was his sanctuary, a place where his children, Emily and Sarah, could laugh and play, free from the chaos of the world outside. And Rebecca, his steady and loving wife, was the heart of their family, the one who kept everything running smoothly while David's voice echoed in homes across the city. David's relationship with his children was one grounded in safety and love. He was the kind of father who could be counted on to show up at every important event, every school play, every basketball game. But it wasn't just about being physically present, it was the way he made each moment feel special. Whether it was taking the time to teach Jay how to ride a bike or the way he'd listen attentively to Joseph's endless questions about the world, David made sure his family always felt heard and valued. Even the simple moments, like dinner together, were filled with laughter. Emily would talk about her day at school, Sarah would chime in with her ever-present sense of humor, and Rebecca would smile, her eyes crinkling at the edges as she watched the dynamic unfold. David, in those moments, would quietly sit back, his eyes filled with pride not just in the success of his career, but in the life he had built, the family he had created. His radio career, while demanding, never took away from his commitment to his family. His ability to provide both emotionally and financially was a delicate balance, one he navigated carefully so that his children always felt safe. His voice was his gift to the world, but his family was his reason for everything. They were his anchor in a world full of noise and chaos. But in the span of one afternoon, that world would be turned upside down. The safety, the love, the unspoken promise that he would always be there for them, none of it would matter when tragedy struck without warning, stealing away his two beloved daughters, leaving him helpless in the face of a nightmare he never saw coming. And suddenly, the comforting voice that had once brought peace to so many would be left with the one sound he could never ignore: the silence of his daughters, gone forever. It was in the chaotic symphony of daily life that Rebecca Turner truly thrived. While David Turner's voice echoed across the airwaves, providing comfort to thousands, Rebecca was the steady pulse of the Turner household. A mother of four, each child with their own personality, quirks, and needs, Rebecca's life was anything but calm. Yet, in the midst of this whirlwind, she created a sense of harmony and warmth that anchored her family, making their house a home. Mornings in the Turner house were always a rush. The clinking of dishes, the hum of the washing machine, and the sounds of children's laughter and complaints filled the air. Rebecca had long mastered the art of multitasking, preparing breakfast, organizing the kids' schedules, and managing the day-to-day chaos with a calm that was nothing short of remarkable. It wasn't just about the physical tasks, she was the emotional glue that held them all together, her presence a comforting constant. Her days were filled with moments of tender love and frustration in equal measure. She navigated the tricky waters of sibling rivalry between Jay, the oldest son who was beginning to crave independence, and Joseph, the youngest, whose endless curiosity often led him into trouble. She soothed Emily's teenage frustrations and helped Sarah organize her school projects, all while keeping an eye on the clock, ensuring the household stayed on track. But beyond the logistical challenge of managing four children, Rebecca provided something far deeper: a sense of security. In her eyes, every challenge was an opportunity to show her children that they were safe, loved, and supported, no matter what the world outside looked like. She knew exactly when to comfort, when to let go, and when to push her children to be better versions of themselves. Her patience was endless, even when it seemed the world was closing in. The Turner family wasn't just bound by blood, they were united in their shared experiences. Rebecca's role as mother wasn't just a title, it was the foundation upon which their world was built. The family dinners, chaotic as they were where everyone came together, where laughter could always be heard despite the piles of homework and unfinished chores. There was a rhythm to their lives, a predictable harmony that made the Turner household feel like a fortress against the outside world. But in an instant, that harmony would be shattered. As the Turner family went about their daily routine, Rebecca knew that, in her own way, she was the one holding everything together. She often found herself quietly watching Emily and Sarah, her two daughters who, despite the age gap, were closer than ever, always sharing a joke or an unspoken look that only sisters could understand. Rebecca would smile to herself, feeling a deep sense of contentment, unaware that the balance she worked so hard to maintain would soon be torn apart by the cruelest of fates. The chaos, it all came together in those quiet moments when she'd catch herself watching them, feeling like no matter how chaotic the world around them became, this little bubble of peace was enough. But that afternoon, when Emily and Sarah left the house for what seemed like an ordinary trip to Maplewood Mall, that fragile peace began to unravel. Rebecca had no idea that this seemingly simple gesture, letting her daughters go off on their own for a while, would be the last time she would see them both together, safe and whole. The sudden absence of the girls would leave a void in Rebecca's life that nothing could fill. What was once an orchestra of life filled with noise, love, and chaos would soon fall into a haunting silence that would never quite disappear. The sun shone brightly through the kitchen window as Rebecca Turner prepared breakfast, her mind momentarily drifting. In the midst of the morning chaos, the sound of Emily and Sarah's laughter reached her ears, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt perfectly ordinary. Emily, with her growing maturity, was always so thoughtful. At 14, she was already taking on the responsibility of caring for her younger siblings, her protective nature emerging with every passing day. Sarah, just 2 years younger, was the lively one, the spark that brought energy and light to any room. Their bond was unspoken, yet it was always palpable, like an invisible thread that held them together. Years ago, when Emily was just 8 and Sarah only 6, the world seemed simpler. Emily would always be the first to rush to her mother with a book in hand, asking questions that revealed a curiosity far beyond her years. Her love for reading had already set her apart, her sharp mind always striving to understand the world around her. Sarah, on the other hand, had never been content to stay still. She'd run circles around their home, her giggles filling the air, her energy almost boundless. While Emily lost herself in stories, Sarah was busy creating her own, inviting Emily to play pretend, turning the backyard into a magical kingdom where anything was possible. Rebecca would watch them in those rare quiet moments, smiling as she saw Emily guide Sarah, teaching her how to make daisy chains or showing her how to bake cookies. Emily had always been the nurturing one, the kind of older sister who would lay down her own toys just to make sure her younger sister had the most fun. Sarah, in return, was the likeness to Emily's more serious nature. While Emily had grown cautious with age, Sarah never stopped laughing, never stopped seeking adventure. She was the free spirit who pulled Emily out of her shell, coaxing her into games that ended with the two of them covered in mud, giggling uncontrollably under the summer sun. Their bond was effortless, and Rebecca knew that there was something special about the way they shared their childhood, a harmony that felt indestructible. One winter afternoon, the Turner family gathered in their cozy living room, the fireplace crackling as the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. It was Christmas, and Sarah had just unwrapped her gift, a small, fluffy stuffed bunny. She held it up triumphantly, her face lighting up with pure joy, while Emily watched, a soft smile playing on her lips. Emily had never been one for material gifts, but the look on her sister's face made the holiday that much more special. As Rebecca and David exchanged glances, it was clear that these moments, these simple family holidays, were everything. As the evening wore on, Sarah, clutching her new bunny, made up stories about it, casting it as a brave hero who rescued other stuffed animals from the clutches of evil. Emily listened intently, adding in her own ideas, their voices blending together in perfect harmony, like two parts of a single cherished melody. The bond between them was so effortlessly woven, so natural, that Rebecca often found herself holding her breath, afraid of how fragile it all seemed, afraid that the perfection of their love, their joy, would one day slip through her fingers. That evening, Rebecca watched as Emily and Sarah sat by the fire, the warmth of their closeness enveloping them both. It was one of those rare moments of peace where everything felt safe. The world outside seemed miles away. It was just the four of them, nestled together in the comfort of home, and for Rebecca, it was a moment of fleeting perfection. But then the clock struck 11 a.m. on March 25, 1989. The peace of that morning shattered as Emily and Sarah stepped out of their house, oblivious to the fate awaiting them. The world, which had once been filled with light and laughter, began to darken. And with every step they took toward Maplewood Mall, the invisible thread that had held their childhood so securely began to unravel inch by inch. Rebecca had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would hear their laughter, the last time she would witness their warmth before the storm hit. The warmth of those memories would forever echo in her heart, serving as a painful reminder of the fragile nature of life and love. That simple, perfect moment, the one where everything seemed right in the world, was gone, replaced by an emptiness that would haunt Rebecca for the rest of her days. The air that morning felt different, charged, almost electric. Emily Turner and Sarah Turner could barely contain their excitement, their voices rising in a chorus of chatter as they bounced around the kitchen. In a few days their birthdays would arrive, and each sister had 1,000 plans swirling in her head. For Emily, turning 15 meant a new chapter. She thought about the upcoming years, about the possibilities that awaited her, and the weight of the world that would soon be expected to settle on her shoulders. Sarah, on the other hand, couldn't care less about the passing of time. At 12, she was still wrapped in the innocence of childhood, her days full of wonder and her dreams running wild with adventure. "Can you believe it, Em? We're almost there," Sarah squealed, her voice filled with that unmistakable glee that only a birthday could bring. Emily, a little more subdued but no less excited, nodded enthusiastically, her eyes sparkling as she adjusted the way her hair fell across her face. She was thinking about the presents, new books, new clothes, and of course the party. Rebecca Turner, their mother, always made their birthdays special, filling the house with balloons and laughter, making sure no detail was overlooked. David Turner, their father, would always make sure the day was just as memorable, even if his schedule was packed with radio shows and public events. This was their moment, shared, intimate, and full of everything that made childhood feel limitless. The kitchen was alive with energy as Rebecca flitted from counter to counter, making breakfast, occasionally stopping to laugh at the girls' excitement. "Are you sure you'll both be able to keep the surprises a secret until the big day?" she teased, knowing full well how hard it was for the girls to resist spilling their birthday plans to each other. The girls shared a look, one that only sisters could understand, and both burst into giggles. The sense of joy was contagious. The entire room felt warmer, the very air pulsing with the energy of their shared enthusiasm. Sarah, always the first to voice her wishes, jumped up from the table and began pacing excitedly. "I hope I get that new scooter. You know, the one with the red wheels. And maybe even some of those glow-in-the-dark stickers for my bedroom. Oh, and a big cake. A big chocolate cake with extra frosting." Her words tumbled out in a rush, and for a moment she was lost in the dream of all the things that could make her birthday perfect. Emily watched her sister with affection. She wasn't quite as animated, but the warmth in her smile was unmistakable. "I think I'll ask for a new set of sketchbooks," she mused aloud. "Maybe some art supplies too. And, a new bracelet, something sparkly." She glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were already darting toward the window as if dreaming up new ideas. The joy on Sarah's face made Emily smile even brighter. It was a rare moment of peace in the Turner household, a brief lull before the rush of life swept in once again. The thought of birthdays, of cake and laughter, was enough to momentarily suspend any worries. They were safe in the warmth of this moment, together, under one roof, with nothing to interrupt the purity of their happiness. And yet, despite the carefree joy that seemed to envelop them, an odd stillness settled over Rebecca Turner as she listened to the girls. There was a fleeting, unspoken feeling that lingered in the back of her mind, a quiet warning she couldn't fully ignore, even though she tried to push it away. As she looked at Emily and Sarah, filled with the kind of innocent excitement only children could possess, Rebecca couldn't shake the thought that these moments, these simple, joyous moments, were slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp them. It was an ordinary morning, filled with ordinary excitement. But beneath the surface, Rebecca felt the faintest stir of something that told her the world they knew was about to change forever. Still, she pushed the thought aside, smiling as she joined in on the girls' excitement. Today was about the girls. Today was about the Turner family, bound by love, celebrating birthdays and togetherness. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow was a dream they could hold on to as long as possible. The morning air felt like a secret, the kind of secret that only spring could hold. The scent of fresh rain lingered on the breeze, mingling with the earthy sweetness of blooming flowers. It was a fleeting moment, the brief window where the world felt alive with possibility. Emily and Sarah Turner could feel it, could almost taste it as they stepped out the door. The grass under their feet was soft with dew, the kind that sparkled like diamonds in the early morning sunlight. Spring break was finally here. For a brief moment, the weight of schoolwork and responsibility was forgotten, replaced by the lightness of freedom. The cool breeze swept through the neighborhood, teasing the leaves of the trees, and the sun, still gentle, still soft, peeked through the branches, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk. It was the kind of morning that promised adventure, and in the hearts of Emily and Sarah, excitement bloomed like the flowers around them. Emily felt the shift in the air before she even stepped outside. She inhaled deeply, letting the clean, fresh air fill her lungs. Her mind wandered, away from the routine to the day ahead. The crispness of the air felt like a canvas waiting to be painted with the laughter of friends, the thrill of exploring new places, and the unspoken promise of memories yet to be made. It was the sweet freedom of childhood, the feeling of not having to worry about anything but the moment you were living in. As she looked at Sarah, her younger sister was already bounding down the porch steps, her laughter ringing out like a bell. Sarah was the embodiment of spring, bursting with energy, an ever-present smile that could brighten the grayest days. Her footsteps were light and quick, her excitement palpable in every movement. It was the kind of enthusiasm that couldn't be contained, the kind that made Emily smile despite her own quiet, introspective nature. "Race you to the mall?" Sarah shouted, already halfway down the sidewalk, her voice bubbling with the kind of eagerness only a 10-year-old could muster. Without thinking, Emily took off after her, her sneakers hitting the pavement with soft thuds, the wind pulling at her hair as she raced to catch up. For a moment, the world narrowed to just that: the warmth of the sun, the scent of spring, the sound of her sister's carefree laughter ringing in her ears. They reached the street corner, winded but laughing, the weight of the world still miles away, hidden behind the promise of a carefree day. Emily looked at Sarah, her little sister, full of innocence and joy. There was something comforting in the simplicity of it all. No deadlines. No schedules. Just them, together, chasing the endless possibilities of spring break. In that moment, the world felt perfectly right. Nothing could ruin it. Not today. The houses on their street, the neighborhood they had grown up in, all seemed to blend into the backdrop, a gentle hum of life that carried them forward. Emily felt the excitement rise in her chest, mixing with something softer, an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the ordinary magic of the day. There was a newness to everything. The sunlight, filtering through the leaves, shimmered like a promise that, for a few hours at least, there were no rules, no expectations, just the simple joy of being young, of being free, of being together. The street was bathed in a warmth that matched the swelling of anticipation in Emily's chest. The sound of birds singing, the distant hum of passing cars, the soft rustle of leaves, it all seemed to echo the joy of the moment. And as the sisters walked toward Maplewood Mall, the world felt suspended in time. It was the kind of day that, in the years to come, they would look back on long after everything changed. It was the kind of day that, in that moment, felt like it would last forever. The front door creaked open, and the cool morning air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of fresh grass and possibility. Emily and Sarah Turner stepped out into the world, their laughter echoing down the driveway as they exchanged excited words about their plans for the day. Rebecca Turner, standing at the threshold, watched them with a quiet smile, but her heart tightened ever so slightly. This was the kind of morning that felt like it would stretch on forever, a perfect beginning to spring break. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow on the yard, the world filled with warmth and promise. But as Rebecca stood there, her mind whispered a warning. She couldn't ignore this moment, this peace, would slip away too quickly. Something told her that today would be different, that something she couldn't yet see was waiting just beyond the corner of the street. "Girls, remember?" Rebecca called out, her voice light but firm. "You need to be home by 4 o'clock. I don't want you wandering off or getting distracted." Emily, as always, nodded with that quiet, responsible maturity that marked her growing adolescence. "We'll be back, Mom. Don't worry." She flashed her mother a reassuring smile, the kind that was meant to ease Rebecca's mind, but didn't quite reach her eyes. The excitement in Emily's voice rang with the kind of carefree joy that only a 14-year-old could feel on the first day of break. But Sarah, with her exuberant energy, bounced on her heels and flashed a wide grin. 4 o'clock, we promise. We'll be so quick you won't even know we're gone." She was already halfway down the front steps before Rebecca could finish her sentence, the younger girl's laughter fading into the morning air like a burst of sunlight. Rebecca's gaze lingered on them both for a beat longer than usual. The knot in her stomach tightened, her protective instincts kicking in. "Make sure to stay together, okay? I don't want you running off on your own." Her voice was softer now, quieter, almost as if she feared saying it too loudly would make it real, make something bad happen. Emily paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back over her shoulder. "We'll be fine, Mom. You know we always stick together." Her tone was confident, but there was something in the way she said it, something just a little too calm. A small part of her, too, couldn't shake that feeling of unease that had begun to creep in. Rebecca nodded, forcing a smile, her heart heavy in a way she didn't quite understand. She stepped forward to offer them both a final piece of advice, her voice tight with the kind of urgency she couldn't ignore. "And if anything feels off, anything at all, don't hesitate to come straight home. I'll be waiting for you, okay?" There was a flicker of hesitation in Sarah's eyes, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "We know, Mom. We're not babies." Sarah shot her a wink, the excitement of the day already too much to contain. With a quick wave, she was off again, tugging at Emily's arm, eager to get going. As the girls bounded toward the sidewalk, Rebecca remained standing at the door, the knot in her stomach tightening even further. She knew it was irrational, this feeling that something was lurking, just out of sight, but it gnawed at her. The warmth of the sun seemed to grow colder, and the cheerful noise of the morning began to feel like a distant echo, fading in the wind. She stood there, watching them walk away, the quiet of the morning now pressing in on her. She wanted to shout after them, to call them back, to wrap them in her arms and keep them safe forever. But she didn't. Instead, she silently watched them until they were out of sight, the faint sound of their voices mixing with the breeze. And then, just as the last whisper of their laughter disappeared, Rebecca turned back into the house, the door closing softly behind her. The tension in her chest remained, unresolved and unanswered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the day ahead, full of joy and promise, would unravel into something she would never be able to stop. She tried to ignore the voice in her head, telling her that this moment, this simple goodbye, was the last time she would see Emily and Sarah together, laughing, carefree, as if the world could never touch them. But that voice wouldn't be silenced, and Rebecca knew, somewhere deep inside, that her daughters would not return the same way they had left. The world at that moment felt perfectly ordinary. But deep down, Rebecca Turner knew that something was about to change forever. The air in Maplewood Mall buzzed with the typical hum of a busy afternoon, families shopping, teens wandering between stores, and the distant clink of coins from arcade machines. Emily and Sarah Turner stood outside the Orange Bowl Pizza restaurant, chatting animatedly about their plans for the day, completely unaware of how drastically their lives were about to change. But then the atmosphere shifted, like the slow creep of shadows before nightfall. A man, tall and impeccably dressed in a brown suit, approached them with a confident stride. His appearance seemed almost too perfect, his suit crisp and polished, his shoes gleaming in the midday sun. He held a briefcase in one hand, an odd yet sophisticated touch for an afternoon at the mall, and as he drew nearer, a faint smile crossed his face, his eyes scanning the girls as if he had known them forever. "Excuse me, girls," he said, his voice smooth and inviting. "I'm with WDC Radio. We're doing a special segment on local kids, and I'd love to record a few voices for our show. You'd be famous, your friends would hear you on the radio." He grinned, his expression warm, his tone light. At first it felt like a harmless encounter. Emily, always curious and a bit reserved, exchanged a glance with Sarah, whose eyes immediately sparkled with the thrill of being part of something special. Sarah, ever the extrovert, was the first to speak. "Wow, on the radio? That sounds amazing," she exclaimed, bouncing on the balls of her feet. The idea of being in the spotlight, of doing something that made her feel seen, made her practically glow with excitement. She looked at Emily, eyes wide with anticipation. "Come on, Em. This could be so cool." Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. There was something off about the man, something unspoken that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. He seemed friendly enough, but why was he approaching them in a mall? WDC Radio? Emily had never heard of a station doing something like this before. Still, it was Sarah, always the daring one, who tugged her hand, urging her to step forward. "Let's do it, Emily. This could be fun. Mom'll never believe it." Reluctantly, Emily took a small step forward, drawn into the strange opportunity that felt like it might be too good to pass up. Sarah grinned wider, pulling both of them closer to the man as he opened his briefcase with a soft snap. "You'll both love this," he said smoothly, his voice warm and rich, as if he had perfected the art of drawing people in. He pulled out a small microphone and a recorder from the case. Emily felt a flicker of doubt, something she couldn't quite place. But the warmth of the afternoon sun, the bustle of the mall, and the infectious energy of Sarah made her push the unease aside. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks. After all, what harm could a simple recording do? As they took turns speaking into the microphone, Emily felt a rush of exhilaration, a fleeting moment where the world felt normal again. She laughed nervously, a little self-conscious about hearing her voice over the speaker. The man seemed genuinely interested in what they had to say, nodding encouragingly and complimenting their voices as if this was just another everyday transaction. But then, as Sarah stepped forward to speak into the mic, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had settled deeper inside her gut. The man's smile never quite reached his eyes. And the more she watched him, the more she noticed small details. How his hands trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted the recorder, how he seemed to be watching them with an intensity that didn't sit right. The afternoon sun, once warm and inviting, now felt strangely oppressive. The world around them seemed to blur slightly as the man's gaze lingered on them too long, and the noise of the mall, the chatter of shoppers, faded into the background. It wasn't until a neighborhood boy who had seen Emily and Sarah many times passed by and did a double take that the tension began to build. He slowed, squinting for a moment. The man who had never appeared on their street before was talking to the girls, and something in the boy's gut twisted, though he couldn't place why. He was just another kid walking past, oblivious to the significance of this moment. But what the boy didn't know, what neither Emily nor Sarah realized, was that this encounter, this seemingly innocent conversation, would forever alter the course of their lives. The boy looked away after a moment, dismissing the situation as nothing more than some friendly adult doing a harmless favor for a few kids, just like he had seen dozens of times before. Little did he know, his casual observation would be the last normal moment of his life too, before everything turned upside down. Emily, her mind still tangled in uncertainty, gave Sarah a quick, hesitant look, her eyes narrowing just for a second as the man gestured for them to take a seat. The man's smile grew wider, more deliberate, and Sarah, ever trusting, ever hopeful, eagerly complied. Emily, still unsure, took a seat beside her sister, the fleeting thrill of being famous sinking into the heavy silence of something more unsettling. As Sarah leaned in to speak into the microphone once more, a creeping doubt began to settle over Emily. Something was off. And before she could voice her discomfort, the man's voice rang out again, smooth and calculated. "You too will be remembered for this, trust me." That was the moment Emily felt it, the moment the innocence of the encounter slipped away, replaced by the chilling sense that something was terribly wrong. The weight of the world pressed down on her, her stomach twisting into knots as the day, full of promise, suddenly felt like it was slipping out of her control. The scene felt deceptively ordinary, a sunlit afternoon at Maplewood Mall, the soft chatter of families drifting through the air like background noise. Emily Turner and Sarah Turner stood by the Orange Bowl Pizza restaurant, the smell of fresh pizza wafting from the open door, their faces lit up with excitement. As Sarah bounced on her heels, animatedly planning the day ahead, Emily stood a bit more still, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, eyes scanning the busy mall. She felt that slight prickle of unease, something just out of reach, but she dismissed it quickly. This was the kind of day she had looked forward to for weeks. The start of spring break, a day free of homework, of obligations. But then the man appeared. He was well dressed, a little too polished for the setting. His brown suit was sharp, pressed neatly, a look that could have belonged to anyone in WDC Radio, the station her father worked for. He approached them with a purposeful stride, his steps slow and deliberate. His appearance seemed harmless, even familiar, as he smiled gently and addressed the girls. "Excuse me, ladies," he began, his voice smooth, the kind of voice Emily had heard 1,000 times on her father's radio shows. Warm. Trustworthy. "I'm with WDC Radio and we're doing a special segment on local kids. We'd love to have your voices recorded for our show. It'll be fun, you'll be famous, your friends will hear you on the air." He held out a small microphone attached to a recorder, his smile never wavering. Emily, already drawn in by the casual tone and the familiarity of the radio reference, felt her shoulders relax. Her father's job meant she had grown up around people who spoke for a living, who used microphones and recorded voices. There was a natural trust in that. Sarah, always more enthusiastic, didn't hesitate for a second. She took a step forward, her face brightening immediately. "That sounds so cool," Sarah exclaimed, bouncing toward him without a second thought, her trust given easily as it always was. Emily glanced at her sister, her brow furrowing for just a moment. She felt the unease deepen, just enough to stir something in her chest. But the warmth of the day, the gentle sound of Sarah's laughter, and the reassuring familiarity of the man's tone convinced her that there was no harm. This was, after all, just another part of the ordinary excitement of the day. "Okay," she said, shrugging off the discomfort. "Let's do it." As Sarah eagerly leaned into the microphone, Emily watched the man's every move, though she couldn't fully explain the unease building in her gut. His hand lingered on the recorder a little too long, his fingers brushing against it almost too possessively. It wasn't the way her father had handled the equipment. It was different. But she let it go, trying to shake off the feeling. The man's smile remained steady, his eyes a little too intense for someone supposed to be harmless. Then, as the man directed Sarah to speak into the microphone, Emily noticed something else. A figure standing off to the side caught her eye. A young man, shabby and disheveled, was moving through the mall with a nervous energy. His eyes darted between the groups of teens walking around, lingering a little too long on the Turner sisters as they spoke with the well-dressed man. His clothes were ragged, his face partially hidden beneath a mess of unkempt hair. There was an unsettling tension to his movements, like he was unsure of where to go, unsure of who he was watching. Emily felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach as she watched him. He wasn't part of the crowd, there was something wrong about him. But before she could voice her concern, he vanished into the crowd, lost in the ebb and flow of mall-goers. Yet something about his presence lingered in the back of her mind. Sarah, oblivious to the tension around them, continued chatting with the man, laughing and joking as though nothing was wrong. The entire scene felt oddly surreal. The warm sunlight, the smell of fresh pizza, the sound of children laughing, it should have been the perfect afternoon. But as Emily looked around, her gaze kept returning to the corner of the mall, to the shadow of that young man who had watched them. For the briefest moment, Emily felt the eerie calm before the storm. The moment when the world seemed to hold its breath, unaware of the dangers slipping in unnoticed. The man's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You two have wonderful voices. I think we'll make a great team," he said, his words smooth and practiced. He was smiling again, his tone still reassuring, but the warmth had begun to feel hollow. Sarah laughed, not hearing the tension that hung in the air, and Emily tried to shake off the feeling that had settled like lead in her chest. The world around her seemed a little quieter, a little colder, and even the sunlight, which had felt so comforting before, now seemed distant. The man reached into his briefcase again, pulling out a second microphone, the movements slow, deliberate, as if he were stalling. Emily felt herself hesitate, but before she could voice the thought creeping into her mind something wasn't right, she looked at Sarah, who was smiling so brightly, and felt a pang of guilt. How could she ruin this moment for her sister? This was supposed to be fun. Just another adventure on spring break. Yet, as she stood there, staring at the man's calculating smile, a cold certainty began to settle in. The sense of impending doom grew stronger, like the silence before a storm. And the man, seemingly harmless, offering them an opportunity to be famous, was only a pawn in a much darker game. The girls, lost in their excitement, remained blissfully unaware of the danger lurking just beneath the surface. The danger that was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The warmth of the spring day began to feel like a distant memory. Rebecca Turner paced the kitchen, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than the last. 4:15 p.m. The girls were always punctual. But as the hands on the clock inched toward 4:30, her unease deepened. The scent of dinner, now cold on the counter, seemed to mock her. The sound of her footsteps, quick and uneven, echoed in the quiet house, a rhythmic reminder of the growing tension that sat heavy in her chest. She glanced toward the window, her eyes scanning the empty street. Why weren't they home yet? She had heard Emily and Sarah leave that morning, so full of energy, so sure they'd be back in time. For 30, she thought. No need to panic. They were fine. It was just the mall after all. A harmless afternoon. But as the clock continued to tick, Rebecca couldn't shake the creeping dread that gnawed at her. The world outside seemed peaceful enough. Birds chirped, the distant hum of traffic, the quiet lull of the neighborhood, but something inside her was unraveling. The minutes seemed to grow heavier, expanding like a balloon about to burst. 4:45. No sign of them. Her thoughts spiraled, racing through 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. What if something happened? She forced herself to focus on the mundane. She wiped the counter, checked the refrigerator. She busied herself with little tasks, anything to distract her from the gnawing sense of dread that was slowly turning her stomach. But the longer she stood in the kitchen, the more aware she became of the empty spaces in the house. The quiet. The silence that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. Then she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. David had returned from the radio station. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. He'd know what to do. She didn't want to appear frantic in front of him, but as she turned toward the door, the unspoken fear that had been building for over an hour was now impossible to ignore. David Turner stepped into the house, his presence as familiar as the smell of the old leather chair he always sat in. He gave her a brief smile, the kind that reassured, that promised everything was okay. But even before he said a word, she could see it in his eyes. He knew. He could feel the same unease creeping over them both. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Where are the girls?" Rebecca didn't answer at first. She looked at him, her chest tightening. The air between them thickened with an unsaid question. Where were they? Why hadn't they come home? "They should have been back by now," she whispered, almost to herself. "They've never been this late. Not once." David nodded, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight rigidity in his stance. The weight of their unspoken fear grew. Rebecca didn't need to say it aloud. She could see the same thought flickering in his mind. Something was wrong. He set down his briefcase and moved toward her. "We'll call the mall, check with their friends, maybe they're just caught up somewhere." His words were steady, calm, but there was a slight tremor in his voice, barely noticeable, but it was there. A crack in the armor. The minutes ticked on louder now. 5 p.m. Then 5:15. By now, every passing second felt like an eternity. Rebecca didn't trust her own thoughts anymore, each one spiraling into darker scenarios. She had lived long enough to know that time, when stretched like this, could be an enemy. The longer it passed, the more impossible it became to silence the growing fear. "I'm going to call the mall," David said, his voice slightly distant now, as if he were already preparing himself for the worst. Rebecca nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. She moved slowly toward the living room, her breath shallow, eyes flickering between the clock and the window. The distant hum of life outside, the streetlights flickering on, felt like a cruel reminder that the world was moving on without them, without her daughters. She could hear David in the other room, speaking to someone on the phone, his voice muffled but urgent. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every breath felt harder than the last. She could no longer pretend this was just a delay. The fear she had been trying to suppress was now too loud to ignore. David entered the living room, his face pale, and Rebecca saw it, the unmistakable weight of uncertainty in his eyes. "They're not at the mall," he said quietly. His words hit her like a cold wave, the reality of them washing over her. "No one's seen them since around 1 o'clock. They should have been back hours ago." It felt like time stopped altogether. Rebecca's stomach lurched, and for the first time since Emily and Sarah left that morning, she felt the icy grip of panic settle over her. This wasn't just an ordinary delay. The air in the house grew dense, heavy, filled with unspoken dread. Rebecca could feel the distance between them, the space in the room growing too large, too cold. They were parents, both of them anchored by years of routine, of love, of safety, but this was different. Something was shifting. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. What was there to say when fear had taken hold? David looked at her, his eyes hardening, the mask of calm slipping just a little. He reached for his jacket. "We're going to find them." In that moment, Rebecca knew that everything had changed. The dread she had felt earlier was now a sickening reality. Something was wrong. And no amount of waiting, no amount of time, could bring back the normalcy they had taken for granted just a few hours before. As David moved toward the door, she stood frozen in place, her heartbeat the loudest sound in the room. The clock ticked on. Time felt like it was slipping away. And the longer it stretched, the more impossible it seemed to believe that everything would be okay. They would search. They would call. They would try everything. But in the back of Rebecca's mind, a thought repeated itself louder and louder with each passing second. What if they never come back? The phone rang, its shrill tone echoing through the silent house, the sound grating against Rebecca Turner's nerves. She stood frozen, her hand trembling as she held the receiver to her ear. David, his jaw clenched, stood beside her, pacing, his footsteps sharp on the hardwood floor, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last, until the voice on the other end finally broke through the tension. The operator's voice was cold, mechanical, too calm for the storm swirling inside Rebecca. "Riverdale County Police Department, how can I help you?" The words hit Rebecca like a slap. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She felt the panic rising, sharp and raw in her throat, but it was swallowed by the weight of the operator's indifference. David's voice broke the silence, his tone forced, controlled. "We need to report 2 missing children. Can you provide their names and a description, please?" The operator responded, her voice flat, professional. There was no sense of urgency. No sense of the terror that Rebecca and David were now drowning in. Rebecca gripped the counter, her fingers digging into the cold surface as her heart pounded in her chest. Emily and Sarah, her daughters, were out there, somewhere, and the world around her seemed to ignore the panic building in her chest. Emily Turner, 14, and Sarah Turner, 12. They were supposed to be back hours ago. "We've tried calling them all, but no one's seen them." David's voice was tight, controlled, but the tremor in it was unmistakable. The operator's response was swift, detached. "Okay, I've made a note of that. We'll send someone to the mall to look into it. It's not uncommon for children to get distracted, but we'll have officers check the area." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. The words "distracted" felt like a slap to her. How could the operator be so calm? It was as though she was speaking about someone else's child, not her girls, who had disappeared without a trace. She turned away from David, her hand still gripping the phone as the weight of the silence in the room pressed down on her. Her thoughts spiraled. What if they weren't just distracted? What if something was wrong? What if Emily and Sarah were out there, helpless, afraid, and no one cared enough to act quickly? The operator continued speaking, her words lost to Rebecca's racing mind. "And we'll get in touch with you once we have more information." Rebecca could hardly hear her over the sound of her own thoughts. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a simple mix-up. The familiar panic that had been gnawing at her since the girls were late was now turning into a suffocating certainty. She could feel it in her bones. "Are you still there, ma'am?" The operator's voice broke through her fog. Rebecca blinked, struggling to focus. She had to respond, had to give the operator what she needed to get help. But no matter how many times she repeated the details of the girls' descriptions, her mind kept coming back to the same terrible thought. Something was wrong. Her voice trembled as she replied, "Yes. Yes, I'm still here. Please hurry." The operator's tone remained unchanged, impersonal. We'll send someone as soon as possible. Please stay by the phone. If anything changes, don't hesitate to call back." Rebecca hung up, her legs buckling beneath her. She sank to the floor, the cold reality of the situation hitting her all at once. This wasn't a game. This wasn't just some harmless delay. David knelt beside her, but Rebecca didn't look at him. She couldn't. She was lost in the growing horror in her own chest, the terrifying possibility that Emily and Sarah might never come home. The clock ticked, each second a reminder that they were slipping further away from the normal life they had just hours before. Her thoughts raced as the room seemed to close in on her. How long had they been gone? Why hadn't they come back? Why wasn't anyone taking this seriously? What was happening to her daughters? The house, once so full of life and love, felt impossibly quiet now. David's voice broke the silence, but it didn't seem to reach her. She could only hear the rhythmic beating of her own heart, each thump echoing her growing dread. Rebecca tried to focus on his words. "We'll get them back. I promise we will." But even as he spoke, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that the world was slipping through her fingers, slipping away from her in ways she couldn't control. The air felt thick with it, with the creeping realization that she had no idea where her daughters were and the fear that she might never see them again. The clock continued to tick, each second dragging them deeper into the unknown. If you've been following the story this far, you know how much these moments matter. But imagine being in Rebecca Turner's shoes, waiting for the call that might never come. Imagine watching time slip away, unsure if you'll ever hear your daughter's voices again. Now, think about the simple things you've taken for granted today, your family, your loved ones, because for Rebecca, those moments are slipping through her fingers, and there's nothing she can do to stop it. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't wait until it's too late. The kind of connection this story is about, it's priceless. Join us now and don't miss out on what happens next. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if your world came crashing down just like this? Let us know. We're all in this together, but time is running out. The hours stretched on, but the silence that filled the Turner home was deafening. Rebecca and David Turner waited, helpless, as their world slipped further into uncertainty. Emily and Sarah had been missing for hours, and the tension was so thick it felt like it could suffocate them. Then, as dusk fell, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the stillness. Law enforcement had arrived. The first responders, a pair of officers from Riverdale County, pulled up to the house with urgent efficiency. Their car doors slammed shut with a decisive thud, their boots hitting the ground as they strode toward the door. They didn't say much. There was no small talk. It wasn't a routine call anymore. This was no longer just a missing persons case. The officers immediately set to work. One took notes, the other quickly began making calls, and soon a search party was assembled. The area around Maplewood Mall became a flurry of action. Volunteers, neighbors, strangers, even teens gathered in the growing dusk, driven by the need to find the girls to bring them home. There was no time to waste. Officers and volunteers scoured the parking lots, spoke to store employees, and questioned anyone who might have seen Emily and Sarah. The crisp air seemed to amplify every sound, and every creaking branch or footstep felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 fears. David and Rebecca stood together on the porch, a heavy silence between them, their hands clutched tightly as they watched the growing search unfold in front of them. They didn't speak. What was there left to say? The urgency in the officers' movements was unmistakable. David, trying to stay composed, met the gaze of a police officer who paused momentarily, holding up a hand as a gesture of support. "We'll find them, Mr. Turner. We're doing everything we can." "Don't worry," the officer said, but there was a strange stiffness in his voice. He had been trained to comfort, to provide reassurance, but he couldn't hide the doubt behind his eyes. David nodded, his jaw tightening though his mind was spiraling. He wasn't sure whether to trust the words or not. Meanwhile, Rebecca stood in the doorway watching David and the officers. The community around her, once a source of safety and familiarity, now felt distant. People were moving, doing things, offering their help. They were here trying to help them to save their daughters. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that the world was moving on, as if their grief, their panic, wasn't a part of it. The volunteers gathered on the lawn, murmuring amongst themselves, but even as they set off into the night, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The hope they carried wasn't enough to banish the fear that loomed over everything. It wasn't just the missing girls, it was the gnawing sense of impending loss that seemed to hang over everyone in that moment. As the crowd dispersed into the growing night, Rebecca turned to David, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really think they'll find them?" Her words hung in the air, trembling with a fear that she could no longer suppress. She turned her eyes back to the group of officers and volunteers, but her gaze was distant there, but not truly seeing. The small moments of comfort, the reassurances from the police, seemed to slip away in the overwhelming weight of the unknown. Before David could respond, a neighbor, Frank, who lived 3 houses down, approached, his face filled with concern. He placed a hand on David's shoulder, a silent offering of solidarity. "I'm so sorry, Dave. We're all praying for them. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." His voice cracked, and David could see the same grief mirrored in his eyes, a grief that he couldn't yet share. Rebecca, too, felt the weight of that unspoken sorrow, a reminder that they weren't alone, but at the same time they were. The people surrounding them, good people, the kind that would rally together in a moment of crisis, offered support, but their faces, etched with fear, only reminded Rebecca of the growing chasm between her and the world outside. Her thoughts were consumed by Emily and Sarah. Her whole being ached with the need to protect them, to hold them close. As David returned to the house to fetch something for the officers, Rebecca stood there, unable to move. The search outside, the police action, felt like a blur of movement, of people trying to piece together the fractured puzzle of her daughter's disappearance. But in the quiet of her mind, all she could hear was the deafening silence in their absence. The first siren in the distance broke her from her thoughts. Another squad car, another set of officers. The search was intensifying, but the longer it stretched on, the more Rebecca felt a creeping fear that no one could quell, not even the well-meaning faces of the people around her. Every passing hour felt like a weight pressing harder against her chest, and the sense of helplessness was consuming. The sirens faded into the night as the search continued, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Emily and Sarah were farther away than ever, slipping through her fingers, hidden by the cruel uncertainty of time. Every passing minute, every new face offering help, only deepened the feeling of isolation she couldn't escape. The tension mounted, and the town's efforts seemed a mere distraction, a means of showing solidarity in the face of something too horrific to name. But for Rebecca, none of it mattered, not the volunteers, not the police. All that mattered was finding her daughters before it was too late. The sun had set hours ago, but the search for Emily and Sarah Turner was far from over. The air was thick with tension, a charged stillness that clung to the edges of every movement. David and Rebecca Turner watched as law enforcement poured into the area around Maplewood Mall, their eyes scanning every face, their minds racing through every possibility. The search was no longer just a casual effort. It was an all-out, full-scale operation, and every minute counted. The sound of search dogs barking echoed through the parking lot, their noses low to the ground as they moved from one section to the next. The handlers gave brief, sharp commands, their faces set in grim determination. Every time a dog barked, it felt like the world might finally move toward an answer, but each time the handlers were left with only the smell of wet pavement and unyielding silence. The dogs were a small hope in an ocean of uncertainty, their noses leading them to dead ends time after time. Meanwhile, police officers set up roadblocks at all entrances to the mall, stopping cars and questioning drivers with growing urgency. They sifted through security footage, revisiting every inch of the mall's parking lots and nearby alleyways, searching for any clue, anything that would lead them to the girls. Officers ran over their reports, their voices strained, trying to keep their composure, but the weight of the unknown was palpable. Each face that passed through the roadblock seemed to carry a heavier burden, as if the entire neighborhood knew the stakes but no one had the answers. News vans arrived, their satellite dishes pivoting toward the sky, setting up cameras as reporters gathered in clusters, their microphones in hand, ready to broadcast to the world. The hum of the cameras and the shouts of reporters created an uneasy backdrop, their presence making the Turners feel exposed, like their grief was being paraded for all to see. The cameras flashed as David and Rebecca were approached by an officer, his voice low, as if trying to shield them from the growing spotlight. "We need to stay focused," the officer said, but his eyes betrayed his concern. "We're doing everything we can, but there's no solid lead yet." Rebecca nodded numbly, her hand gripping David's arm as the officer moved away to speak with another group. The spotlight didn't feel like help. It felt like another weight pressing down on her, something more to bear. She couldn't escape the suffocating feeling that the more they searched, the further Emily and Sarah slipped away. Across the street, another officer, flashlight in hand, scanned the abandoned buildings that lined the outskirts of the mall parking lot. The buildings, their windows boarded up and their doors chained shut, loomed like silent witnesses to the unfolding nightmare. David watched as officers disappeared inside the crumbling structures, their flashlights slicing through the darkness, but there was no sound of discovery, no word of hope. The intensity of the search had reached its peak, but the silence in the air grew louder with every passing moment. In the dim glow of the streetlights, David turned to Rebecca, his face pale. "I don't know what to think anymore," he whispered, his voice cracked with a quiet desperation. Rebecca didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't trust her own voice anymore. The only sound that filled her ears was the distant echo of police radios and the harsh scrape of gravel beneath boots. Minutes passed, but Rebecca couldn't stop looking at the road. She couldn't stop listening for the sound of their footsteps, the sound of her daughter's voices. The camera shifted back to the officers, their movements faster now, more frantic as they combed through more sections of the mall, and back to the Turners, frozen in place, desperately clinging to the fading hope that a miracle might occur. Rebecca's mind raced between the possibilities. What if they were just lost somewhere, scared and confused? Or worse, what if they were? What if they were? The thoughts were too terrible to entertain. The scene shifted again, this time to an officer pushing through the crowd, his voice urgent as he passed by David and Rebecca. "We've checked the entire lot again. No sign of them." He gave them a quick glance, his face softening for a moment, but the words he spoke made the silence feel more deafening than before. David closed his eyes, trying to hold it together. Rebecca's heart pounded. She could hear Emily's voice in her head, clear and untainted, laughing, teasing, so full of life. She could feel Sarah's small hand in hers as they walked through the mall just hours before. How had everything gone so wrong? The thought churned in her stomach like acid. She looked to David, her eyes searching for some kind of reassurance, but she saw only the same fear reflected back at her. The same helplessness that mirrored her own. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, but the search continued. Searchlights now lit up the parking lot like daylight, cutting through the night, but still no leads. The officers moved with purpose, but every direction they turned felt like a dead end. David turned to Rebecca, his voice low. "We have to believe they'll find them. They have to." He was holding on, but Rebecca saw the cracks forming in his armor. It wasn't just the girls they were searching for anymore. It was every ounce of hope that had been slowly stripped away with every passing hour. The camera cut between the frantic officers searching the parking lot, the officers scouring the abandoned buildings, and the Turner family, caught in the waiting game, drowning in the abyss of uncertainty. The world outside felt so distant, so far removed from the agonizing stillness in the house. Rebecca felt like she was being swallowed by it. Then the faintest glimmer of light. An officer's voice crackled over the radio, but the words were drowned out by the surge of dread that immediately filled her chest. Was it good news? Was it a sign that they had found something? Her breath caught, the air around her thick and heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. They had found nothing. Not yet. The phone rang just as the last sliver of daylight vanished from the sky. Its shrill tones sliced through the heavy silence in the Turner home like a knife. Rebecca Turner stood frozen in the living room, staring at the phone with a mix of disbelief and dread. She had been waiting for something, anything to break the suffocating uncertainty. David was pacing again, his footsteps harsh against the floorboards, as if he could will the call to come, will the answers to materialize. Rebecca's fingers trembled as she reached for the receiver. The briefest flicker of hope sparked inside her. Maybe this would be it. Maybe this was the call she had been waiting for, the call that would bring her daughters home. Hello? Her voice was steady, but she could hear the tightness in it, the tension that had built up over days of unanswered questions. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence stretching uncomfortably before a voice spoke, a low, garbled voice, deep and distorted. "We have your daughters." The words hung in the air, like a nightmare becoming real. Rebecca's breath caught in her chest, her pulse quickening. Her mind immediately jumped to the impossible, the one thought that had haunted her since that terrible morning. They were alive. They were out there. They hadn't been taken from her. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath but firm. She couldn't let the panic take over, not yet. Not when there was a glimmer of hope. The voice on the other end was still garbled, but its words were unmistakable. $10,000. Bring it to the old warehouse off 5th Street. Alone. Don't tell the police or we'll. The line crackled and the sentence was lost in static, but the message was clear. Rebecca's heart raced, the hope in her chest swelling like a balloon being inflated, fragile and desperate. She exchanged a look with David, his face too stricken with a mixture of hope and fear. They had the money. She had no idea how they would come up with that much cash on such short notice, but at this moment nothing else mattered. This was real. This was happening. Her daughters were alive and she would do anything to get them back. Rebecca's voice was trembling now, but she managed to speak. "Please just tell me where they are. Are they okay? Are they hurt?" She clutched the phone tighter, praying for any reassurance, any sound, anything that would confirm her worst fear wasn't true. The silence on the other end of the line deepened, thick and suffocating. The seconds stretched out, unbearable. Then the voice finally responded, still distorted but carrying a finality that made Rebecca's stomach turn. "You'll get them back. If you do as we say." The line went dead. For a moment, Rebecca just stood there, the receiver still pressed to her ear. The room felt like it was spinning, the world outside slipping away into a haze. She hadn't breathed in what felt like an eternity, and when she finally exhaled, it came out in a shudder. David, they're alive." She gasped, her voice cracking as the tears welled up in her eyes. David rushed to her side, his hand on her arm, trying to steady her. They were alive. She had heard it. They were going to bring them back. She clung to that, letting the weight of it settle in, a small spark of light in the overwhelming darkness. But then, as quickly as the hope had arrived, a cold, sharp thought struck her. What if it was a lie? What if it wasn't true? What if this was another cruel hoax? Her chest tightened, the terror starting to creep back in as she looked at David, his face a mirror of her own uncertainty. David's hand tightened on her arm. "Rebecca, do you think this is real?" The question hung in the air, the words stabbing at her fragile hope. Rebecca felt the breath catch in her throat again. The dread that had been simmering under the surface now surged forward, engulfing her. Could she really trust this call? Could she allow herself to believe that her daughters had truly been taken, only to be returned? Before she could respond, the phone rang again, the sharp tone cutting through her thoughts like glass. Her heart dropped. Was it them? Was it the ransomers calling to set the exchange in motion? But as she grabbed the phone again, her pulse racing, her heart full of dread, the voice on the other end was not the distorted voice from before. Instead, it was the cold, emotionless tone of the police officer she had spoken with earlier. "Mrs. Turner, we've been unable to trace the call. We've checked the number, but it's unregistered. The ransom demand is likely a hoax. Please don't act on this yet. We're still trying to track down leads, but this might be a trick. Asterisk asterisk." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Rebecca's knees nearly buckled beneath her. Her world spun back into chaos. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The hope that had just been so vibrant, so palpable, faded in an instant, pulled out from under her like the rug had been yanked from her feet. She looked at David, her hands shaking, unable to speak. The silence between them now felt colder than before, more ominous. The dream of having her daughters back, just out of reach, slipped further and further away. The truth, so ugly, so painful, settled in. Her daughters were still missing. The call had been nothing more than a cruel joke, another dark thread in the web of uncertainty that had woven itself around them. Rebecca's heart sank, the realization that their world was still broken, still torn apart, closing in around her. The feeling of helplessness never left her again. The days blurred together. Each passing hour, each fruitless search felt like another drop in a bottomless well. David Turner sat at the edge of the table, staring at the papers scattered before him. Rebecca Turner stood by the window, her eyes distant, as if she could see her daughters in the crowd of passers-by outside. But no matter how hard she searched, no one had seen Emily and Sarah. The witness sightings came in like a wave, each one a beacon of hope that collapsed just as quickly. A white Pontiac seen speeding down Oak Street. The description of a beige Ford with tinted windows parked outside a convenience store just outside town. Every lead sounded promising at first. Every theory was met with hope. But with each new sighting, the Turners were met with nothing. Just more unanswered questions. Cut to the mall parking lot. An officer stands beside a witness, listening intently as they describe the white Pontiac. The officer makes a note, nodding in acknowledgement. "We'll follow up." But as the witness walks away, the camera lingers on the officer's face, a flicker of doubt crossing their features. The car had been long gone by the time the witness had seen it. The lead wasn't solid. It never was. Cut to a disheveled man standing in front of a gas station, claiming to have seen Sarah and Emily earlier that afternoon. His words were jumbled, his story inconsistent. He gave them a beige Ford to look for, but his memory seemed fractured. Was he sure? "I saw them, I'm sure of it," he insisted, but his eyes betrayed him. The officers took down the details, but Rebecca felt a pang in her chest. The truth had become clouded. And the more people they spoke to, the less certain they became. Cut to an officer, staring down at his notepad as he shakes his head in frustration. Another dead end. The Turners could hear the echoes of those words, over and over again, in the quiet of their own home. David had stopped asking about the leads, stopped asking the officers how close they were. The silence between him and Rebecca had deepened with each passing week, each dead lead that only drew them further into the abyss of uncertainty. Rebecca, once the pillar of strength, now carried the weight of her doubt like a physical burden. She could no longer trust the promises made by the police. Her hope was a fragile thing, teetering on the edge of exhaustion. She would sit up late into the night, tracing the same streets in her mind, the faces of people who might have seen something, but every theory felt like a ghost chasing shadows. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like a cold tomb. David would come home from his fruitless meetings with the police, his face drawn with exhaustion, and walk straight into the room where Rebecca sat. They didn't speak anymore, not about the case, not about their daughters. There were no comforting words left to offer. They both knew it now. The investigation had become an endless spiral of false hopes and empty promises. The toll was visible on David's face. He had lost weight. His jawline, once strong and unyielding, was now softened by the weight of years of grief. His eyes no longer held the same determination. He would look at Rebecca, but there was a void between them, an emptiness that neither of them could fill. They hadn't spoken in days about the real thing they both feared, the fear that their daughters were gone, lost to them forever. Cut to Rebecca, watching an officer speak with a witness outside their home, her face pale. The officer's words were lost on her, as the frustration of the investigation began to take root. The thought of them fading from the police's memory, becoming just another case number, was unbearable. The camera panned across their faces, capturing the growing despair and the empty promises that filled their days. David's hands shook as he gripped the chair in front of him. The officers, once full of urgency, now felt like distant strangers. The faces of those they had trusted had begun to blur. The steady rhythm of their world had cracked and splintered. The weight of all the unspoken doubts had eroded everything they once believed in. The constant rehashing of every possible lead began to break down what was left of their spirits. David, once a man of certainty, now stared blankly at the television as the news recapped the ongoing search for Emily and Sarah. Each new report, each repetition of their daughters' names, felt like a painful reminder of what they had lost. He was no longer the confident father he had once been. His heart was heavy, his will broken by the endless cycle of false hope. Rebecca, too, had changed. Her eyes, once filled with love and warmth, now seemed empty, hollowed out by the slow, agonizing passage of time. She would sit for hours, staring out of the window as the world outside continued moving, while she remained frozen in place. The once vibrant home had become a house of ghosts, of memories that refused to let go. They had tried everything. They had fought for answers, but now, every step forward felt like 2 steps back. The faces of the police officers who once reassured them, now felt distant and impersonal. The leads had become routine, lifeless, like a cruel game where no one won. David and Rebecca had become prisoners of their own hope, shackled by the uncertainty that grew every day. The world outside their door seemed to carry on, oblivious to their pain, but inside, in the quiet, they were losing themselves. The agony of Emily and Sarah's absence, and the crushing silence that followed, had begun to take its toll. As the investigation grew colder, the Turners couldn't help but wonder, had the authorities given up on them? Were they just another case to be swept under the rug? The question lingered in the air, an unspoken truth neither of them wanted to face. And with that question came the slow, insidious unraveling of everything they once knew. The calendar pages turned like a slow, relentless march, each day swallowed by the unyielding passage of time. The years felt like a blur, slipping away unnoticed, each one bringing a new season, a new set of birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, but always without Emily and Sarah. The sharp, raw ache of that first year without them faded into something more unbearable, the empty space between expectation and reality growing wider with every passing day. The world outside changed. Spring after spring the flowers bloomed and faded. Summers came and went, and with each one Rebecca Turner found herself standing in the same spot, looking out the window, watching the world move on without her. The world had never felt so indifferent to her grief. The harsh clamor of life went on. Children grew older, neighbors had babies, and families celebrated their milestones, but in the Turner home, nothing had changed. The first year without Emily and Sarah was marked by an unbearable heaviness. Their absence was felt in every corner of the house, in the silence of their rooms, in the stillness of the kitchen, where the laughter that once filled the air was now replaced with a hollow emptiness. Rebecca would walk past their bedrooms and linger by the door, her hand resting on the doorknob, as if holding on to the faint hope that she might hear their laughter spilling out again. David, too, had become a shadow of the man he once was. His eyes, once filled with the warmth of a father's love, were now clouded with grief, and his once steady, comforting voice cracked under the weight of the uncertainty that had become their constant companion. The second year the grief began to take on a new shape. The holidays came again, the Thanksgivings and Christmases, and with them came new expectations that everything should start to feel better, that they should be healing, moving forward. But the empty chairs at the table, the absence of Emily and Sarah's presence, was a wound that refused to close. Rebecca had tried to make it through the season with a brave face, but every tradition felt hollow. The expectation that time would heal them felt like a cruel joke. As much as she tried to carry on, the void only deepened, the ache becoming something permanent. By the third year, the hope for resolution had begun to dissolve. David had retreated into himself, barely speaking of the girls anymore. The photos on the wall, once filled with life, now looked like ghosts frozen in time. Rebecca, still holding on to the faintest glimmer of hope, began to wonder if she was the only one still looking for answers. The phone calls from the police had slowed down, their updates fewer and further between, until eventually Rebecca realized they were no longer actively searching, no longer as urgent. The passage of time had dulled their resolve. And yet, every year, like clockwork, Rebecca Turner would set a place for them at the table. She would light the candles at Christmas just as she always had. She would keep Emily and Sarah's rooms as they were, never changing a thing in case they came back. The smallest spark of hope never died. It burned quietly in the corner of her heart, hidden beneath layers of grief and disappointment, but it was always there, flickering, refusing to be extinguished. The fourth year was quieter. Rebecca had learned to smile again, to carry on, to play the role of a mother without her children. But the emptiness, the feeling of being lost in a world that had gone on without them, was suffocating. David became more withdrawn, retreating into his work at the radio station, as if trying to drown out the constant reminder of his failure as a father. Rebecca couldn't blame him. She too felt like she was suffocating, like there was no room left in her heart for anything else but the haunting memory of those two girls. But then came the fifth year, and Rebecca knew she couldn't go on like this. She couldn't live in the shadow of their disappearance forever. She had to let them go. She had to believe that, somehow, they had found peace, even if she never would. But as she stood in their rooms, running her fingers over the dust-covered shelves, the weight of the years pressed down on her, crushing her chest. She felt like she was drowning in the moments that had passed, in the milestones they would never reach together. And yet, every passing year, Rebecca could feel the years of longing pulling her back, like a heavy anchor tied to her soul. She couldn't outrun the memories, couldn't escape the way their laughter used to fill this house. Every birthday, every Mother's Day, every anniversary without them was a stark reminder of what had been lost. And still, she couldn't stop herself from holding on to the belief that one day they would return. One day they would walk through the door and the years of waiting would be over. But with each new year, the house became more and more silent. The photographs in the hallway, their faces frozen in time, became more of a haunting reminder of what once was. Time, in all its cruelty, had taken so much from them: their hope, their laughter, their future together. And still, Rebecca couldn't let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, Emily and Sarah were out there somewhere, waiting for the day when they could come home again. But as the years bled into one another, the Turners were left with a cruel, undeniable truth. Time had not healed them. Time had only made the empty spaces in their lives larger, deeper. The void had become a part of who they were. And the questions, they never stopped. Would they ever find out what happened? Would they ever know where their daughters were? Or had time simply taken everything from them, leaving nothing but the remnants of lost hope? As another year passed, Rebecca Turner stood at the window once again, watching the world move on without her. The seasons had changed. The world outside was still turning. But inside, in her heart, it was always March 25th. And she was still waiting. The house was quiet, too quiet. David Turner sat in his favorite armchair, the one that used to creak when he rocked back and forth, but now it only groaned under the weight of years. His hands rested in his lap, and the faint tremble in his fingers betrayed the weight of his thoughts. Rebecca Turner stood by the window, her gaze lost in the fading sunlight as it spilled across their backyard, the trees casting long, haunting shadows. It felt like the world outside was still, frozen in time, while the years had marched on without them. Rebecca turned slowly, her voice soft, carrying the weight of decades of grief. "Do you remember when Emily used to sit at that old kitchen table, her little hands scribbling away on a piece of paper, telling us about the stories she was going to write?" She didn't wait for him to answer. David could hear the sadness in her voice, the way it wavered as she spoke, as if the memories were too much to carry. David's mind wandered to those early years, back when their house was filled with noise, laughter, and warmth. Emily was only 7 then, with her bright eyes and a mind so full of dreams. She would drag her chair to the table and begin her drawing stories of dragons and castles, and she'd make up characters that spoke to her, characters that felt more alive to her than the world around her. David could almost hear her excited voice. "Look, Dad! Look what I drew. This dragon's going to save the world." His chest tightened at the thought. "And Sarah, she never stopped moving," Rebecca continued, her voice cracking. "She was always so full of energy. Even when she was little, running around with that goofy grin, talking a mile a minute about the next big adventure she was planning." David closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back in that time. Sarah, only 4, her wild curls bouncing as she raced across the living room, never slowing down. He could hear her voice, high-pitched with excitement, as she tried to get him to play with her. "Come on, Daddy, let's build a fort. We'll save the world together." The memories flooded back in waves. The sound of Sarah and Emily laughing together, the warmth of their presence filling every corner of the house, the smell of Rebecca's cooking wafting from the kitchen as the girls helped her stir the pot. Everything was alive then. Everything had purpose. But now, it felt like that warmth had been extinguished, like the house had been left with only shadows. The girls were gone, and all that remained were the fragments of the past, scattered and unreachable. David's heart ached as he thought about how long it had been since their voices had filled this space. Rebecca stepped closer to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "They were our whole world, Dave. Do you ever think about what they would have become? What their lives would have looked like?" David's voice was thick with emotion as he whispered, "Every day." His eyes looked far off, lost in the memory of 2 little girls who had once filled the world with light. He could almost see their faces again, their smiles so bright that they seemed to outshine the sun. He could hear Emily's soft voice, and the way Sarah's laughter would always bubble up unexpectedly, like a song that had no end. "And the birthdays," Rebecca said, her voice quieter now. "Do you remember the last one?" Emily was so excited to get her art supplies, and Sarah had been going on about her new bike for weeks. The words hit David like a wave. He could see it the last birthday they celebrated together, the last time they were all under one roof, laughing and sharing a cake. Emily had been so proud of the card she had made for Rebecca, carefully drawn with crayons and markers. Sarah, her energy boundless, had insisted they all go out for a walk after cake, even though the night was already starting to fall. They had walked, hand in hand, down the quiet streets of their neighborhood, under the glow of the streetlights as if the night would never end. David swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of that memory. "I still dream about that night." His voice cracked, the sorrow that had been buried deep inside him suddenly breaking free. Rebecca nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Sometimes I wonder if they would have been here, Dave. Would they have come back? Would they have walked through that door like nothing had happened?" The silence between them stretched longer than it ever had before. It was an unspoken truth, one neither of them could avoid any longer. The years had passed, but the question, what had happened to Emily and Sarah, still haunted them. And the longing for answers, the desperate hope for closure, had eroded everything else. Their love, their memories were all that was left, but even those felt like they were slipping through their fingers, fading with each passing year. David stood up slowly, his knees creaking, and walked over to the mantelpiece where the photos of their daughters still stood, the faces frozen in time, forever young, forever lost. His hand hovered over the frame with Emily's smiling face, so full of life, and Sarah's mischievous grin beside her. They would never grow older. They would never come home. Rebecca joined him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. They stood there side by side as the house seemed to close in around them. The years of waiting, of searching, had taken their toll. But even now, even after everything that had happened, they couldn't bring themselves to let go. They were still the parents of Emily and Sarah, the girls who had once filled their lives with love, light, and laughter. And no matter how many years passed, that would never change. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they're still out there, Dave?" David's gaze never left the photo. "I have to believe they are." The camera pulled back, capturing the two of them, standing in the shadows of their daughter's memories. The weight of time, the years lost in the search for answers, pressed down on them. But the love for Emily and Sarah still burned in their hearts, a faint but persistent flame in the dark. The silence that filled the room was heavy, suffocating, but it was also a bond that neither time nor distance could ever break. The cold case files had gathered dust for years, pages yellowed with age, rubber bands snapped, and folders long forgotten. But in April 2024, as the last remnants of hope seemed to slip away, a single phone call shattered the silence. Sergeant Chris Hamrock, a seasoned investigator with a relentless drive, had been assigned to the Turner case. And though it had been 36 years since Emily and Sarah Turner disappeared, Hamrock was determined to find answers. The moment he sat down at his desk, the case files felt like a weight pressing down on him. The old reports, the unanswered questions, they were more than just ink on paper. They were ghosts that had haunted the Turner family for far too long. The pressure to solve it now, to bring justice after so many years of waiting, felt like an unbearable burden. He knew what he was walking into. But he also knew he couldn't walk away. His fingers moved over the dust-covered files, flipping through the old witness statements, the half-formed leads, the failed attempts. Everything had been dead ends until something caught his eye. A name. Lloyd Lee Welch. It had been buried, hidden deep within the unsolved files, just another name in a pile of forgotten possibilities. But there was something about the way Welch's statement had been dismissed that made Hamrock pause. The officer who had handled the case in the early days had brushed Welch aside. The man had been a troubled soul, unreliable, a drunkard with a history of lies. No one had thought to follow up on his statement, which, at the time, seemed inconsequential. But as Hamrock reread the notes, something clicked. Something felt wrong. This was the lead that had never been fully explored, never given the attention it deserved. The clock ticked louder in the quiet office, each second adding more weight to the decision he was about to make. Hamrock knew this could be his one shot at solving the case. He couldn't let it slip away. His fingers hovered over the phone, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. What if this was the key? What if this statement, long ignored, could lead to the breakthrough they so desperately needed? He picked up the receiver, his voice sharp and determined. "Get me Lloyd Lee Welch." The phone call was brief but chilling. Lloyd Welch, now in his mid-60s, was living in a small rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. When Hamrock arrived, the man looked exactly like the image Hamrock had imagined. Ragged, weary, a lifetime of poor choices etched into every line of his face. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap alcohol clung to him, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking slightly. Welch had been an enigma all these years, a man who claimed to know something important but had never been able to provide the details. The local police had dismissed him, but now, with everything at stake, Hamrock needed to dig deeper. The door creaked open, and Welch's bleary eyes flickered with recognition. The man was still sharp in some ways even after all this time. "You're the one who's come to finally listen." "I've listened before, Mr. Welch, but this time, I need you to tell me the truth," Hamrock replied, his voice steady, but the air around him grew thick with the weight of the unspoken history between them. Welch leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I know what happened to them." A chill ran down Hamrock's spine. The words he'd been waiting to hear, and yet they felt like a trap. Welch's eyes darted to the corner of the room, as though he were afraid someone else might hear. The room seemed to close in around Hamrock, the space growing smaller as he took a step closer. His pulse quickened. "Then tell me, Mr. Welch, what happened to Emily and Sarah Turner?" Welch's lips twitched into a half-smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I can't just give it to you. You've got to earn it. I'll tell you, but first, you've got to understand the whole story." Hamrock's jaw tightened. He had a job to do. He needed answers. But the fear in Welch's voice, the hesitation, sent a warning shot through Hamrock's mind. There was something he wasn't saying, something that lay just beneath the surface. This wasn't going to be easy. "I'll do whatever it takes, Welch." Hamrock's voice was steely, unwavering. For a long moment, Welch said nothing. His eyes darted around the room as though he were waiting for some unseen force to intervene. Finally he spoke again, his voice low and ragged. "I know where they are. I know what happened to them, but I'm not gonna make it easy for you. You need to understand I did things. Bad things. But I can't tell you everything unless you're ready to hear it." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, suffocating and heavy. Hamrock felt the weight of them. This wasn't just a case of missing children. This was something far darker, something that Welch knew but wasn't ready to reveal. The investigation had just taken a dangerous turn. Hamrock leaned forward, his voice a mixture of calm and urgency. "Tell me, Welch. Every word. Start from the beginning." Welch looked down, his fingers twitching as if he were holding something back, his face contorting in a mix of guilt and fear. "I was there that night. I saw everything, but it wasn't supposed to happen like this. You won't like what you hear, but I'll tell you." Hamrock could feel the tension in the room building, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The investigation, The hope that had been reignited with Welch's confession now felt like it was about to unravel. The more Welch spoke, the more Hamrock realized that they were on the edge of a much larger, more dangerous truth, a truth that could shake the very foundations of what they thought they knew about Emily and Sarah's disappearance. The air seemed to thicken with dread, the clock ticking louder in the background as Welch's lips parted, about to reveal the details that would change everything. But the longer he hesitated, the more it became clear. The answers they were seeking were closer than ever, but so were the dangers they could never have prepared for. The room felt impossibly still. Lloyd Lee Welch sat across from Sergeant Chris Hamrock, his hands shaking slightly as he fidgeted with the edge of his worn jacket. His eyes, bloodshot and hollow, never quite met Hamrock's gaze. The weight of the moment was suffocating. The air, thick with unspoken truths, pressed down on both of them. Hamrock could feel it. This wasn't just a confession. It was the unraveling of a nightmare, the final step toward answers that would never bring peace. Welch had been sitting in silence for what felt like hours, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The heat from the dim light above cast long, twisted shadows on his face, as if even the walls were conspiring against him. His voice, when it finally broke through the quiet, was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of secrets, buried in the darkness. Welch paused, swallowing hard as if the words were too heavy to let out. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to go that far. He dragged a hand across his face, his fingers trembling. But things got out of control. Hamrock leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension tightening around them, every second stretching longer than the last. He had come here for the truth, the brutal, ugly truth. And now, as Welch's voice quivered, the floodgates of that truth were beginning to open. What happened, Welch? Hamrock's voice was tight, but he couldn't let the desperation show. He needed this. They needed this. Welch hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the window as if he could escape the confession by looking away from it. His voice broke as he spoke again, slow and methodical, as if every word were a burden. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He muttered under his breath, as though trying to convince himself more than Hamrock. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve again. They were just two little girls out in the open, innocent. The words sent a chill down Hamrock's spine. He could see the shift in Welch. The reluctant witness was slowly becoming the key player in this monstrous story. Lloyd's voice became quieter, almost strained, as he continued. I was there. I saw them talking to him. He said he could take them somewhere, give them a ride home, but he didn't. He took them somewhere else. The words felt like the floor was giving way beneath Hamrock. The fear in Welch's eyes was palpable now, as if the horrors he had tried to bury were clawing their way to the surface, demanding to be seen. His gaze never met Hamrock's directly, couldn't face it, couldn't face the consequences of his confession. But he couldn't stop talking. They were just kids. Welch's voice was barely a whisper, the remorse in his words thickening the air around them. They didn't know what was happening. His fingers dug into his own skin as if trying to anchor himself. They begged me to take them home. The horror of those words hit like a freight train. Hamrock felt the room close in around him, the walls pressing tighter with every word Welch spoke. This was no longer about a missing persons case. This was something far darker. Welch's face twisted with pain as he spoke the next words. We took them to the Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains. His voice dropped even lower, as if the very mention of the location burned him. We left them there, in the mountains, and I didn't know what to do, so we did what we had to do. His hands trembled, but he couldn't stop. We set fire to them, made sure they couldn't be found. The words were like a punch to the gut. Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains. A place that should have been serene, beautiful, the place where the world felt vast and untouched. Now it was nothing more than a graveyard for two innocent girls. Hamrock felt his stomach twist with disgust, the horror of the location landing on him with the weight of 1,000 chains. David Turner and Rebecca Turner had never imagined it could be this brutal. Burning their bodies, the thought twisted in Hamrock's gut. And the Blue Ridge Mountains, once a symbol of natural beauty, would now forever be linked with their horrific fate. The scene flickered in Hamrock's mind, a flashback of the early days of the investigation. He could see the Turners, their faces full of hope and desperation as they clung to the belief that their daughters were still out there, somewhere waiting to be found. But now, hearing Welch's confession, it was clear the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. "I didn't want to do it," Welch's voice trailed off, but the remorse in his eyes seemed almost too late. He had helped bury the girls in a place where no one would find them. The tension in the room was suffocating. The reality of what Welch had done was slowly creeping into Hamrock's mind, and with every word, it was becoming harder to breathe. How had this man, this weak, trembling man, been involved in such a brutal act? How could someone be so callous, so cold? Hamrock's thoughts raced back to the old investigation. The reports. The leads. The false hope that had filled the Turners' hearts year after year. How many times had they believed they were on the verge of the truth, only to have the lead fall apart? How many years had been wasted, as Welch's dark knowledge festered in the background, completely ignored? "So you were there," Hamrock said, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "And you watched it happen. But you never said anything. Why didn't you speak up sooner?" Welch swallowed hard, his face crumpling as if the weight of the truth was finally crushing him. "I couldn't. I didn't have the guts." He trembled, his voice breaking. "But you deserve to know." Hamrock felt his own resolve slipping. This wasn't just an investigation anymore. This wasn't just a case of two missing girls. This was something much worse, something that would haunt everyone involved forever. But the worst part, Hamrock realized, was that the truth they had sought for so long was now more painful than anything they could have imagined. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. It had been 36 long years since Emily and Sarah Turner had vanished, and now, as September 2024 approached, David and Rebecca Turner sat in the front row, their faces etched with age and grief. They were no longer the hopeful parents they had once been. The years had chipped away at their strength, and the weight of unanswered questions still hung heavily over them. But today they were here. They had made it this far. Lloyd Lee Welch was finally in front of them, sitting at the defendant's table. The man who had taken their daughters from them was about to face the consequences of his actions, and the words guilty plea had already echoed through the courtroom, still ringing in their ears. The Turners, now in their 80s, had waited for so long for this moment, but as they sat there, staring at Welch's downcast face, the emotions were almost too much to bear. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp bang, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. David's hand trembled at his side. He could hear Rebecca beside him, trying to steady her breath, her fingers clutching the armrest as if holding on to something she couldn't quite name. The prosecutors stood and addressed the court, their voice steady, but there was a weight behind every word. "Lloyd Lee Welch, you stand here today as a man who has been given a chance to plead guilty, to own up to your crimes. This is the moment where justice will finally be served, even if it cannot undo the pain you have caused." David closed his eyes, the words stinging like salt in an open wound. Finally, someone was being held accountable. But at the same time, the emptiness in his chest grew larger. Emily and Sarah weren't coming back. No matter what happened here, they would never come back. The prosecutor's words continued to echo, but David's thoughts drifted. He remembered Emily's laughter, how her eyes sparkled with curiosity, the way she'd always ask a million questions about the world around her. He remembered Sarah's endless energy, her never-ending smile, and how she could light up any room with her mischievous grin. But then the words guilty plea hit David like a punch to the gut. The guilt welled up inside him, not for the case, but for not being able to protect them, for not being able to do something, anything to stop what had happened to them. How many years had passed? How many birthdays had they missed? How many anniversaries, how many moments with their daughters had they lost forever? And yet, the plea deal Welch had struck, the 5 years in prison for his part in the crime, felt like a slap in the face. David's fists clenched. Was this justice? Or had it just become another failed attempt to heal the unhealable wound they'd been living with for decades? Rebecca leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think this is it, David? Do you think this is all we'll ever know?" David didn't answer. His heart was torn in two. He wanted to believe that this was the moment, the closure they'd been waiting for, but something inside him still felt like a piece of the puzzle was missing, something that could never be fixed by a plea deal. The pieces of their daughters' lives, what happened to them in those final moments, remained scattered and unreachable. The defense attorney stood and briefly addressed the court, offering Welch's remorse, his plea for a lighter sentence due to his age, and the fact that he had already spent so many years behind bars for other crimes. But none of it seemed to matter. For David and Rebecca, Welch's apology was meaningless. No apology, no plea deal, would ever be enough to bring their daughters back, to erase the years of pain they had endured. Then the judge spoke, his voice calm and formal. "Lloyd Lee Welch, the court accepts your plea. You are sentenced to 5 years for your involvement in the abduction and murder of Emily and Sarah Turner." The gavel struck again and the sentence was official. But in David and Rebecca's hearts, it felt like a betrayal. 5 years. 5 years for the man who had taken their daughters from them forever. A heavy silence settled over the room, the finality of the trial sinking in. David could feel his heart breaking all over again as he turned to Rebecca, her face streaked with tears. They had finally gotten the answer they had waited so long for, but the cost of that answer felt unbearable. They had spent decades searching for their daughters, but now the truth, raw and unrelenting, was finally revealed. And still it was not enough. David's chest tightened. "Is this it, Rebecca? Is this really all we get?" His voice cracked with emotion, and his hands trembled as he reached for hers. Rebecca, wiping the tears from her face, met his gaze. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, but also a quiet resolve. "We'll never get them back, David. No amount of justice will bring them home." Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "But we finally heard the truth. It's ugly and it's painful, but it's the truth. We can't keep living in the shadows anymore." But even as she said it, Rebecca felt the truth like a heavy weight, and with it came the realization that no one would ever know the full story. The images of that night, the horrors Welch had confessed to, would forever remain locked in his mind. They would never get the answers they needed. The gavel struck for the final time, and as the courtroom emptied, David and Rebecca Turner remained in their seats, alone in their grief. The weight of all the years, all the moments lost, and all the pain they had endured seemed to suffocate them. They had waited for this moment for so long, and now that it was over, all that remained was the hollow echo of justice delivered without closure. The years of waiting had led them to this place, but the answers they had hoped for were still just out of reach, as they were left to grapple with the overwhelming, undeniable truth. Their daughters would never come back. The sun had set hours ago, but the house felt frozen in time still, as if the world outside had forgotten to turn. David and Rebecca Turner, now in their 80s, sat side by side in the same worn chairs they had sat in for decades. The Turner home, once full of laughter and joy, now felt empty, the walls echoing with memories of the daughters they had lost. The years had slipped away from them, but the pain never had. It was always there, quiet, relentless. David stared out the window, his wrinkled hands resting on his lap. His eyes were distant, lost in thoughts that seemed to stretch back to a time when the world had made sense, when his daughters had been alive and their future together was something he could touch. But now, their faces forever frozen in time reminded him of everything he had lost. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt at peace. "Rebecca, do you ever think about them?" David's voice was thick with years of grief, the weight of it now permanent in his bones. Rebecca looked up, her tired eyes searching his face. For decades, they had been trapped in a world where the past and the present collided. The absence of Emily and Sarah was a constant ache, one that would never be healed by time or anything else. Every day. Her voice cracked and she paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But it's not just about the girls anymore, is it? It's about what they left behind. What we lost, David. What we never had a chance to say." Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the old quilt covering their laps. She turned her gaze to the empty rooms around them, the rooms that used to belong to their daughters. No sounds of their laughter filled the house anymore, no footsteps running down the hall, no conversations over dinner. The silence had become a second skin. They had never had the chance to bury Emily and Sarah, to lay them to rest, to say goodbye. "We never got to bury them, Rebecca." David's words were hollow, a pain so deep it felt as though it might swallow him whole. The truth, brutal and final, had been handed down, but it had left them with more questions than answers. They had never been able to give their daughters the one thing they deserved: a proper burial. The act of saying goodbye had been stolen from them, just as their daughters had been. Rebecca's voice broke, the weight of the years catching up with her. "It's like we never had closure. They were taken from us, and we never had the chance to mourn them properly." Her words hung in the air, as oppressive and suffocating as the silence around them. The grief had been endless, the longing to hold Emily and Sarah again, to tell them they loved them, to do all the things they had been denied, seemed like an unreachable dream. It was a hole that nothing could fill. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And we'll never have all the answers, Rebecca. We'll never know the full truth. What happened to them in those final hours, how they ended up in the mountains, burned and left to rot. That's something we'll carry with us forever." Rebecca nodded, her heart heavy with the truth. The haunting knowledge that they would never truly know what had happened to their daughters was a weight that neither of them could escape. There would always be a part of their lives that was lost to them, a piece of their daughter's story that would never be found. But then, as David reflected on the years since their daughters had disappeared, a thought began to settle in his mind, a truth, dark but undeniable. Emily and Sarah's story hadn't just impacted them, it had changed everything. The case had forced America to face the stark reality of child safety in a way it never had before. "You know, Rebecca," David said softly, his voice thick with the weight of realization, "Emily and Sarah, their story changed something. It made people pay attention. It made them rethink how we protect our children. It made the world take notice." Rebecca looked up, her gaze focused and clear for the first time in years. "But it didn't save them, David. It didn't save our girls." The words were raw, but they carried an undeniable truth. Emily and Sarah's disappearance, their unsolved fate, had reverberated across the country, pushing new laws into effect, opening the doors to reforms in child protection, and making people question everything they had taken for granted about their children's safety. Their story had ignited a shift in how America viewed the safety of its children. Their loss had fueled change. But it had never been enough. As the weight of this realization sank in, David and Rebecca felt the crushing void of everything they had lost. Their daughters were gone, and though the world had changed in response to their disappearance, nothing could bring them back. They sat in silence for a long time, as the weight of all that had transpired, the lost years, the lost moments, the unanswered questions filled the room. The truth had come too late for them. They had waited too long for closure, for justice, and for peace. In the end, Emily and Sarah's story would live on, not in their arms, not in their voices, but in the legacy of change they left behind. And that, David realized, was both a bitter comfort and a painful reminder of everything they had lost. The world had changed, but it had come at a cost, one he and Rebecca would carry with them to their final days. The story of Emily and Sarah Turner has left a mark on all of us, but their journey isn't over. If you've been moved by their story, if you've felt the weight of their loss and the fight for justice, now is the time to act. Share their story, spread awareness, and keep pushing for the change they ignited. No family should ever be left without answers, and together, we can ensure that their legacy isn't forgotten. Subscribe, comment, and join the conversation. Let's continue to seek justice for the missing, and never stop demanding the truth.